Thank you very much. So, introducing and welcoming Robert Hubbell to Democracy Forward Long Island on this beautiful Tuesday evening, May 13th. Robert, over to you.
Well, it's an honor to be here with you. And let me just say, every time I meet with the grassroots group, I am inspired all over again. And I know that in the end, we are going to prevail because today, across the nation, there are other groups of concerned citizens who are meeting. And that is a new phenomenon since 2016, and it is forming the backbone of the resistance. And so I want to start by thanking you for being here, but also thanking you for being activists at a time when your nation needs you. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Robert Hubbell. I'm a retired attorney, but more importantly, I'm a husband, father, and grandfather who was concerned, along with my wife, in 2016 about the implications of Hillary's unexpected loss for our then adult daughters who were concerned about what the future would look like under Trump. They, like many people, had difficulty watching him or hearing him or seeing him on television. And at my wife's suggestion, I began to write a nightly email to my daughters just saying it's okay if you're not following the news directly. Let me tell you what happened today. And I tried to do that with, a realistic lens of hope that got passed around among friends and became a newsletter that has about 150,000 followers and is read several hundred thousand times a day. I didn't expect that. I'm now retired and it's effectively turned into a full-time job for my wife and me. And it has been an incredible honor, but also as much as I put into the newsletter, I get back from readers. I mean, I have to tell you, it's just incredibly inspiring seeing you all tonight. Thank you for what you do. I'll just add one additional fact about me. In addition to being a husband, father, grandfather, we're here in Washington, D.C. right now because our youngest daughter just had her first child. So that's our fifth grandchild. We had our fourth grandchild 2 weeks ago in Los Angeles. But here's my favorite fun fact about Long Island. It is a glacial moraine, which marks the furthest extent of the last two ice ages. Actually, your North Shore and then kind of the middle of the island mark the advance of the last two ice ages. So that tells you how big those glaciers were if Long Island is a moraine. So this is entitled An Hour with Robert Hubbell. I would be bored of myself after an hour. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to speak for about 12 minutes and then let's have this be more interactive. And really what I want to just do is to sort of say, where are we in this moment and why should we be hopeful that we will not only preserve democracy, but that we'll ultimately be able to rehabilitate, reform, and reclaim democracy. And I think we just have to start with a dose of realism, which is we are in a difficult period. We have a president who is unbounded by the Constitution, by the laws, by his own party, by Congress, by the DOJ and FBI. He's unbounded because the Supreme Court, and this is how I'm going to start my newsletter tonight. John Roberts gave him criminal immunity. And then Roberts said yesterday that he's surprised that there's an attack on the rule of law. Well, no kidding. When you tell the president he's unbounded by the law, what did you expect? But there's also no threat of impeachment. I mean, every day Trump violates the Constitution. And the remedy for that is impeachment in the House and conviction and removal in the Senate. But that's off the table because he has engineered a hostile takeover of the Republican Party. There's no congressional oversight, even apart from impeachment. Democrats don't have a majority, so they can't hold normal oversight hearings and investigations that would bring to light the blatant corruption of the Trump administration. And then he's compromised, he's put in lackeys, he's put in complete, let me be charitable here, people who are unqualified for the jobs that they hold in the DOJ and FBI and the intelligence community. They're loyalists. They're there for one purpose, which is to protect him and to help him exact vengeance. So when you add all of those things up, we are in a moment that is like none other in the history of our nation. And if you're feeling anxious and worried, good for you. There's nothing wrong with your television set. You should be anxious and worried because we have never faced challenges quite like this. We have faced other challenges that have approximated it. The Civil War, of course, tore apart the fabric of our nation. When the Jim Crow laws were ascendant in the South, when we treated enslaved people as not fully human, when we denied women the right to vote, when we forced LGBTQ people to hide literally in the closet. Those were dark periods when Nixon corrupted the government and had a corrupt attorney general. Those all are precedents in history. But never have we had anything like we face now. And then before I get to the bright spots, let's just say this out loud. When all of that is happening, our Democratic leadership has been inexplicably complacent. Now, some of them, like Jamie Raskin and Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and AOC and Jasmine Crockett and even some moderates like Adam Schiff and Chris Murphy and Chris Van Hollen, they're stepping up. But the party apparatus is still flat-footed. Chuck Schumer today, for the first time, said something that he should have said on January 20th, 2025, which is that they are going to oppose every single Trump nominee to the DOJ. Thank you, Chuck Schumer. Why it took a $400 million public bribe to Donald Trump to cause you to say this isn't normal, I don't know. But here we are. So there's still this feeling that our party has let us down to a certain extent. And that's not everyone. And I've tried to give you some of the names, but not all of them. But there are two bright spots. The first is the courts, which I have to say have overperformed expectations in terms of what I thought they would do in stopping Trump's illegal agenda. I think the numbers are something like 200 lawsuits, and about 75–80% of them have gone against Trump. And though the judges who've ruled against Trump by issuing preliminary injunctions, temporary restraining orders, or final judgments have included Trump-appointed judges, Obama, Biden-appointed judges, Bush-appointed judges, Clinton-appointed judges, I mean, just across the board. Now, we have gotten a little bit of sort of ambiguous feedback from the Supreme Court, but I'm hopeful that the Supreme Court will look at what is happening in the courts below and just say there is no way that we can go against the tide here, and that they will, because the Supreme Court itself has been the subject of targets by Trump, that the court will try to come out with a strong series of opinions that will limit his lawless agenda. But if they're not going to do that, we need to know that sooner rather than later. Bad for us if we find that out 3 years from now. So we need to find that out sooner rather than later. And so if the Supreme Court's going to let us down, we need to know that sooner rather than later. Why? Well, that brings us to the second bright spot, which is the grassroots movement. The grassroots movement since January 20th has been tremendous. And I know that DFLI has been out there every weekend or more frequently in protests and have been making our voices heard and really have been exercising the First Amendment right to petition the government for grievances. And not everybody's out there yet. I think they will get out there, or more people will get out there. But I know that there's a tendency among some people who aren't out there protesting to sort of dismiss it. I had one reader who's actually a good friend and a former law partner write to me and say, Trump doesn't care about these protests. And that's exactly right. He doesn't care about these protests. We're not out there protesting against Trump. We're out there protesting so that members of Congress and the Republican Party understand what is going to happen to them in 2026 and hopefully change the minds of 4 of them in the House and in the Senate so we can actually stop Trump's agenda by having a working majority in Congress. We're not out there trying to impress Trump. We're out there trying to give some backbone and spine to Democratic members of Congress. And finally, actually, the second to the last point is we're out there letting judges know that the people have their back, that they can defend the rule of law, that they can defend the Constitution, and that the people are with them, and that they have the legitimacy to stand up against Trump. And then the final reason that we're out protesting is so that we don't change, so that we don't give up, so that we don't give in to despair. And I have heard time and time again from readers when I've said, get out there, show up at a protest, write some postcards, call your congressman. And every time somebody does something like that, not every time, but I hear this enough to believe it, people say, you know what? I feel better. Now I feel less anxious. I feel more hopeful. And so we're out there protesting so that we don't change. We're out there protesting so we will remain courageous. But as good as it has been, it needs to be louder, bigger, more frequent, and more strategic. What we've accomplished so far is great, but Trump isn't going to give up. He just accepted a $400 million bribe in public. Obviously nothing we've done up to this point with the town halls and the May Day demonstrations, the April 5th, they don't bother him. So we need more people. We need to get to a critical mass of 5%, 10% of Americans protesting on a regular basis so that the New York Times can no longer write that tens of thousands of people showed up to a protest when in fact millions of people showed up. We need to get to the point where we can hold a national work stoppage, where we can hold a national transportation strike. And I haven't, and I won't advocate a tax strike, but I'm certain that enough Americans can look to other countries to see where such strategies have been used, to see how effective that they have been, such that it may be a spontaneous movement of people saying, you know what, if the president's not bound by the rule of law, why am I being the chump? Why am I being the person who's out there paying my taxes on time and complying with all the laws when he's telling us by word, deed, and example that it doesn't matter whether you follow the rule of law? Now, that would be wrong, but we do need to get to the point where we have gotten the attention of the corporate overlords of Trump to impress upon them that we have the power to shut down the engine of the economy, the very thing that generates wealth and profit to them and gives them power. And when that happens, when there are enough of us out there, we the people, we are the ultimate guardrail here, and we will prevail. And you can see Trump sort of testing how far he can go and then retreating. That was what the habeas corpus trial balloon was about. It was sort of like, well, can we get away with this? And then he saw the blowback and he stepped back. I think this story about the 747-8 from Qatar is a trial balloon, that he wanted to see if he could get away from it. And he's realizing, I probably can't get away with it. I think that's what's going on with this. So many of his executive orders, most of which never go into effect, but saying that he's cutting prescription drugs. He's not really cutting prescription drugs. He's just saying he's going to do it. He's not really going to tax billionaires. He's just saying that he's doing it so that he can test how far he can get away with this stuff. So I'm at 15 minutes. I've exceeded my 12 minutes. So let me give you a few points here. I'll wrap it up in 60 seconds. What can you do? First of all, don't quit. Whatever you do, don't quit. Even if you feel bad, even if you're anxious or depressed or dispirited, don't quit. Just hang in there so that you're available later in the game. Secondly, if you can be an example for others. People are looking around nervously saying, how should I act in this just insane moment? And then they say, well, I see Mary, I know what she's doing. Maybe I can tag along with her to some protest or to a meeting or to something like that. Just be an example, preach patriotism and courage, use words if necessary. Otherwise, be an example. don't spread fear or panic or rumor or lies. I grit my teeth every time I hear someone respond to an optimist or an optimistic comment by saying, well, yeah, if there are elections in 2026, you betcha there are going to be elections in 2026 because on January 3rd, 2027, every member of the House is termed out. They're no longer in Congress. And 1/3 of the senators are termed out. They're no longer in the Senate. How are we going to replace them? There will be elections run by the states, not by the federal government, not by Donald Trump. We have to have elections. We will have elections. And then finally, I want us to have a little more confidence than we have exhibited. You know, the Trump people talk about a mandate in the election. Bullshit. He didn't even win a majority of the people who voted on November 5th. He won a plurality of those who voted, which was about 2/3 of the electorate, but did not include 90 million Americans who were dissuaded from voting or suppressed from voting or who were not hopeful enough to vote. Kamala Harris lost being president by a couple of 100,000 votes in 3 states. That's how close we were. So we are the majority. They currently have control over the levers of government, but we should have confidence in the knowledge that we do represent the majority of Americans. And all we have to do is make our voices heard. And all we have to do that is to do exactly what DFLI has been doing up to this point. So keep it up. Keep up the good work. God bless you all. And thank you for everything you are doing.
Hooray, hooray. That's exactly what we're thinking about. So great to hear that. Boy, succinctly put a lot of things there. I want to ask you just a couple questions, then we'll open it up here. I know I shared some questions with Robert beforehand. You know, one of the first things you talked about and one of the bright spots was the legal judicial efforts that are encouraging, right? That I think and I think a lot of people are breathing a little easier that a lot of courts, you know, Trump, Bush, everybody is kind of coming down with the rule of law. The question that comes to mind is what happens if the administration doesn't abide by the court orders? And that's part one is what the hell, what's that about? As we understand the DOJ is supposed to enforce that, but they're sort of co-opted at the moment. And then the second part of that is what as a grassroots organization can and should we be thinking about relative to that question in particular?
Yeah, good question. First of all, Trump has already refused to comply with a court order. In Albrego Garcia versus Noam, the Supreme Court ordered him to facilitate the return of Abrego Garcia about 3 weeks ago. He has done nothing for 3 weeks. I would say that is disobedience of a court order. So here we are. Now, he's trying to make it appear as though he is not defying that court order because he does not want to cross that line in appearance, which shows to me that at least some people in his administration believe that willfully disobeying a Supreme Court order would just be a bridge too far, would be too much. I think we should not fear what might happen because either the Supreme Court will step up and issue orders of such clarity that Trump dare not violate them, or he will violate them, or the Supreme Court will shirk, that the reactionary majority will find some way to weasel out of it and avoid a confrontation. As I said in my remarks, if that's going to happen, we need to know that fact sooner rather than later because it tells us that we must act with greater urgency, in greater numbers, in greater frequency, with greater impact by a national strike, by a transportation strike, by civil disobedience, as some elected officials are beginning to do. So we need to know that. And Trump, I think it's a very important point to recognize that Trump has a hold on a minority of the American people. And we can stop him. There is no example of a autocrat or dictator who is able to outlast the majority of a determined electorate. We see time and time again, all it takes is people making their voices heard. I mean, it took one person kneeling in a flower market. It took one person sitting on a bus. It took one person sitting at a lunch counter to start the movement that ultimately prevailed over the forces of darkness and suppression. We're ready for it. And so what I would say is we just need to know what the facts are. Is Trump going to disobey a clear and direct order from the Supreme Court, or is he not? And then once we figure that out, well, we're just going to have to go ahead and deal with those consequences. So I say we should not be afraid of that answer. We should demand it sooner rather than later and then act accordingly.
Robert, do you know if Trump sort of does that, are the people who he's appointed then at risk of arrest or of prosecution? Because it's actually they who are responsible for defying the courts. Do you know if it's
Yeah, I think what's going to happen in the Albrego Garcia case is that Marco Rubio is going to be held in contempt of court.
Yeah.
Or, well, actually, it's against Kristi Noem. But I think Rubio injected himself into that. So either Noem or Rubio will be held in contempt of court. And Judge Boasberg is trying to figure out who the decision maker was, who is refusing to comply with the Supreme Court's order.
Right. No, that will be interesting to see. Let me ask one other question, then we'll open it up. We got a couple more. We'll see what people want to bring to the table. You know, I wrote it down. I'm just going to read it out loud here to you. The one, you know, as we all remember, Michelle Obama saying, "When they go low, we go high," and this strategy clearly didn't deliver the results that we had hoped in the last two elections. You know, Republicans play by a different playbook. And it's almost like how low can you go is kind of their mantra. You know, their readiness to exploit hatred and bigotry and sexism and racism and anti-Semitism, all of the isms they're readily able to bring to the table with no disregard. Are there effective strategies to deal with bullies? Because I grew up in Chicago. I grew up on the south side of Chicago, and there were a lot of bullies there. There was a lot of isms happening there, and it seemed like the only way to beat a bully was being louder, crazier, or meaner. And how do we become what I heard a long time ago, ruthlessly strategic fighters, right? How do we become ruthlessly strategic? And how do we build courage to take on bullies? And I want to put it out there in kind of those stark terms because I think we don't necessarily address it those ways sometimes.
I want to answer that question directly, and I will, but I want to just real quickly go back to some comments about my last comment that people are saying, well, Trump will pardon them or they won't go to jail because, you know, the DOJ, US Marshals the FBI won't enforce those court orders. That may very well be true. And those kinds of, and I'm not criticizing the comments, but those kinds of comments are asking for is, give me a judicial answer, give me a legal answer, give me a process answer that will finally enforce some court order. And if you don't, then it's all for naught. No, it's not. We need to know the answer of whether Trump will pardon or whether Marco Rubio will refuse to comply, to show up, to be jailed in response to an order of contempt. Because if we know that, then that means there should be tens of millions of people out in the streets. There is no more complete or satisfactory answer than that. And asking for some answer short of it, some legal answer or legislative answer, it's not going to happen. Trump has corrupted Congress. He's corrupted the DOJ. He hasn't corrupted the courts, but he may disobey them. So let's stop saying, when are those people going to come and save us, and say, when are we going to save ourselves?
Mm-hmm.
And that will happen when there are enough of us in the streets to do that. To your question, how do you deal with a bully? First of all, let's just acknowledge that Trump is the biggest blowhard around. He is afraid. He made up medical excuses to get out of the draft. Every time someone stands up to him in a real way, he backs down. He's an insecure, frightened little boy inside who's still trying to gain his mother and father's approval, which he'll never get because they're dead. And so he's a bully. And how do we deal with him? Do you know why Donald Trump can be a bully? Because he's got billions of dollars of corporate money, of Saudi princes behind him. The only reason he can do that is because he's got Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg have his back. Let's go after them. That's why Jill and I are out in front of Tesla dealerships every weekend. Because if we can bring economic pain to Elon Musk, which we can and we are doing, he won't have Donald Trump's back. And when other corporate overlords suddenly say, wait a minute, you know what, this is causing too much pain, we're going to back off, Trump is nothing. I mean, without the dark money that he uses to control the Republican Party, he's nothing. He's a blowhard. So ultimately, what we are doing in the streets by making Tesla toxic, by communicating to Republicans that there's going to be a blue wave in 2026, and it doesn't matter how much dark money they have, we're fighting the people who have their backs, who allow them to be bullies. And that's what we're focused on. So let's not worry so much about Trump. I mean, Trump is a clown. Everyone knows he lies in almost everything he says. Everyone knows he's ignorant. Everyone knows he's sort of deliberately uneducated. But he has this feral instinct of inciting people's grievances. That's his superpower if he has one. We can beat that. So what I would say is, let's go after the people who are standing behind him and allow him to be a pretend bully, which is all he is.
Yeah, I think unfortunately he's hired a lot of bullies around him though too. So, and that sort of that seems to be pervasive in some of the agencies and folks I've been talking to in the federal administration. People are scared around for their jobs, they're scared for their all those kinds of things, which comes down. Let's open up some questions. Who's on our group here says, how do we force these contempt citations to happen sooner rather than later? Is there a way to do that? Let me encourage people to put their questions in the chat now if you want, or raise your hand if you want to ask them.
So I can respond to that, which is,
Yeah,
I think the judiciary has acted with extraordinary speed. I mean, the fact that we are having contempt citations 2 months in, essentially, to the presidency is unprecedented. I mean, you normally would not get to this level of enforcement, for 6 months, a year, 2 years down the road. The judges have to uphold due process, and issuing a contempt citation, which would likely be a criminal contempt citation, which would put people in jail, requires a record. It requires due process. And we can't defend the rule of law by saying, let's just break it and just have these judges issue contempt citations. It's frustrating. It will happen, I believe, and I believe it will be enforced by the Supreme Court. And then we will have a constitutional crisis of whether Marco Rubio, if he's the subject of a criminal contempt citation, will report to go to jail for ignoring a judicial order. And I don't know, I haven't looked at this yet. It's been something I've been meaning to do. I don't know whether a criminal contempt citation is actually a pardonable offense. If anybody knows that and could put that in the chat, I would be interested to know that, because the pardon power only reaches, quote, offenses against the United States. And I think there may be an argument that refusing to comply with a judicial court order is not an offense against the United States in the sense that it violates a criminal law of the U.S. So
interesting. So how do we get people off the sidelines? Do we wait until the pain Trump administration is doing before we act? More people act. I think that's a similar question I have, is how do you, in addition to rallies and demonstrations, how to get people to those, but also what else? What else should we be doing it? What are you seeing?
Yeah. And then we have a question about martial law. So what I would say, and this is anecdotal, and anecdotes are, what's the phrase, the tyranny of the anecdote. They're not necessarily reliable, but I think all of you probably know this in your own life. I mean, Jill and I have been surprised by friends and acquaintances who have watched what we have done in terms of getting out there and protesting. And these are people who we would have never expected, because of their politics or their position, or, for whatever social, religious, cultural reasons, that we would never have expected to do that. And all of a sudden, we're getting pictures of them, at protests. They're sending us texts, or they're emailing us and saying, hey, I did it. I was out there and it was great. And that's the nature of the moment that we're in. You know, mass protest movements start small and they grow and they grow and they grow. And it is happening. I mean, I'm looking forward to the protests on June 14th, 2025, which is Flag Day, and the parade in Washington, D.C., and also Trump's birthday. There are national protests that are planned. And as we do this, and as the outrages pile on themselves, we will get more people out there. And I think we have to be careful about being too impatient for us to expect that there will be, you know, like an instantaneous moment in time where everything changes. I think we will get there, but we're not there yet. And so all I can say is if you continue what you're doing and be loud and proud about it, then even if you affect a few other people, if that phenomenon reproduces itself across the country every day, you're bringing tens of thousands of people into the movement every day. And after a month, that's another 100,000, 150, 200, 300,000 people you're bringing into the movement. And after 6 months, that's several million people you've brought into the movement. And now instead of having 3 million people out on April 5th, you've got 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 million people. That's what we have to do.
Interesting. Yes, I agree with that. You know, one of the things that we're noticing with our membership is there's a lot of people who've joined. There's a core group of people who are really rolling up their sleeves. They've got the time, they're making the time to actively work and do stuff. And there's a lot of people who are interested in, and they're joining demonstrations. They're maybe writing cards, maybe they're writing letters. One of the things that actually we were talking with Indivisible about the other day was how to create the channels of activation or the channels of engagement with those people who are, you know, they got a job, they got kids, they got a family, they can add some time, but they're creating meaningful activity for people to engage with. That's both, you know, meaningful and also interesting and can even be fun. And that's one of the questions that we're dealing with here is how do you channel all that energy outside of the rally or in addition to the rally, which is great. People go home, but then what, right? How are we reaching in, especially since we have two, you know, Republicans out here that we can badger.
Well, what I would say, and I'm going to talk about postcards to voters, but this really is extended to every kind of activism: texting, phone banking, writing, you know, calling your congressman. I frequently, you know, some people will say, well, you know, I mean, people have done studies on postcards to voters, and you know, it only affects turnout at like 1.5% at the margins. It's like, have you noticed how many elections are won?
Yeah.
1.5%? A lot. I mean, it's enough to change control of Congress. But the reason you want people writing postcards to voters, and I mean this in the nicest way possible, is that it's the gateway drug to activism. I mean, once you get someone focused on a race halfway across the country for a Supreme Court justice, there's no going back. And if it's them using 5 calls to call their representatives about an issue, once they see how easy it is, there's no going back. Once they get their first letter to the editor published in the local newspaper, they're going to be writing letters for life. So whatever you can do to get people engaged, just to get them with that little toehold, that's enough, because you just keep them coming back, and then they see that there are other avenues to express their activism, and they will come. So if DFLI has expanded its membership by 300% over the last 3 months,
Yep.
and you don't know what to do to those people, just give them something to do in a group setting so that they can see other people doing it and can be encouraged when they may be feeling disheartened or dispirited. So that's my advice there.
Yeah. There's several questions coming in on the side here. I haven't had a chance to read through them. Let me ask there's a question about birthright citizenship. The Supreme Court is hearing the case Casa versus Trump, which challenges birthright citizenship. On Thursday, there are protests in DC. What can we as a grassroots group do to push SCOTUS to keep the 14th Amendment protections for birthright citizenships? Do calls to SCOTUS help?
So calls and letters to SCOTUS do not help. I was a clerk for a federal appeals court judge, and I was an extern for a district court judge. And in both of those cases, part of my duties was to make certain that the judge received no public input on any of the cases. We screened everything so that there were no phone calls, no letters, no anything. And that's because there are ways in which the public are allowed to weigh in on cases. That's through amicus briefs. And what I would say is yes, protest, because the justices are human beings. They watch the news.
Yeah.
So maybe they don't get letters and phone calls, but they watch the news, and maybe, just maybe, they have to delay their departure from the court or take a different route home so that they avoid protests. So I think it's good to have protests, because that is probably the most effective way to make your voice heard before the justices of the Supreme Court on birthright citizenship. And again, this is an issue that I think is so clear we shouldn't fear the outcome, because if the court is going to say that the Constitution doesn't mean what it says in plain words, well, thank you very much. We'll pursue other avenues of redeeming democracy, and we will just give up hope on the Supreme Court. They're not there yet, and I don't think that they will get there. Let me just real quickly address the issue of martial law. I hear that a lot. First of all, there's no basis for Trump to declare martial law. It's not part of the Alien Enemies Act. It's not part of the Sedition Act. Neither of them permit him to impose martial law. So in order for him to, quote, declare martial law, which is not really a thing that exists except in wartime in areas that are actively under enemy attack, he would effectively need the consent of all of the military leadership to do that. And he's not going to get it. You can imagine that conversation where he says, take to the streets and take over the civilian government and make the American people subjects of an armed dictatorship. It's not going to happen. The people in the military are, for the most part, volunteers. But even those who aren't, they're young people. They're people they join the military to make a better life for themselves and for their family. They're patriotic Americans. They're your nephews and cousins and brothers and fathers. They're the people in the reserve are your pharmacists and your grocers and your school teachers. And they are not going to leave their jobs in your community one day and then put on a uniform, then go out and point a gun at Americans and say, do what Trump says. And this is part of what I mean when I say we need to be careful about the language we use, because saying that Trump can impose martial law, which he cannot, he has no authority to do, legitimizes it. It normalizes it in some sense. And I hope anyone who knows someone in the military knows, for the most part, there are exceptions, of course. Pete Hegseth is an exception. But for the most part, these are men and women of honor who want to defend the Constitution and democracy, and we should not fear them. We should embrace them, and we should look at them actually as a bulwark of democracy, just like we look at the courts and the people.
So we're getting very close to the end here. Let me ask you one other question, or maybe make a request. One of the things that we're seeing here as we grow and expand is there's 1,000 flowers are blooming across the country, and there's a lot of energy sort of creating grassroots groups, but there has not yet been as much coordination across groups to really leverage the power and the scalability of those. On Long Island itself, there's probably 35 indivisible groups. We've been talking with Indivisible about how to, link arms. There's a power in larger numbers. There's the effort that goes into setting up and managing and recruiting and activating a group of volunteers. In the last minute or so, are there places you're seeing, or as you go forward, as you're talking to people and seeing who's got the magic sauce around really linking groups and leveraging the power of the grassroots, that would be incredibly, incredibly valuable.
I think if you look back at mass movements that have arisen in the past, they haven't been coordinated. And that's one of their strengths. You can imagine that if there were a central organization that was running all of the protests across America, the first thing that Trump would do would be to issue an executive order declaring it, a terrorist organization, or saying that it violates DEI, or whatever. He would attack that organization. The fact that there are grassroots organizations all across America, the fact that people are protesting without any organization, that they draw a sign and they go out to their local street corner and they stand out there, makes that protest movement all the more stronger and resilient, because it is not subject to being quashed by attacking a single center. Should we have coordination? Of course. But on social media, that's easy. Someone suggests that a particular date has some significance. We saw that on No King's Day. That was just the suggestion of one guy, and it took off. And then several million people showed up, and it was impossible to stop because there was nobody in charge. When Jill and I are out at Tesla protests, occasionally, a police officer will come by and say, "Who's in charge?" And the answer is nobody. We're just all out here expressing our First Amendment rights to petition the government for grievances. And they just kind of walk away. So I wouldn't worry about the lack of coordination. I actually view it as a sign of strength. And there are groups out there who are focused on this crisis in democracy through an environmental lens. There are groups out there who are focused on it through an LGBTQ lens. At the Tesla dealership protest this weekend, there was one gentleman out there with a sign for trans rights. And I walked up and shook his hand because it's like, yeah, we're all in this together. We all need to be doing this. And it's not picky choosy. It isn't, one person's in charge. I don't think we're going to get that. I think we just have to say, it's up to us. We need to set the example. Let's go out and do it and ask people to follow us. And if enough of us do that, that is going to be ultimately how we defend and reclaim democracy.
All right. I don't know if it's my internet that's slowing down. All right. So we are the internet gods have blessed us so far. I'm going to put my video on because I'm getting bad. I'm getting that internet unstable message. I hope you guys can hear me. Robert, I want to thank you again so much for everything that you do every day and for your commitment to it and joining us here. We know it's inspiring to me. I'm sure it's inspiring to lots of other people. And I'm looking forward to hearing your interview tomorrow. And I think we got some answers for some of the questions from the attorneys in the group here around pardonable sin for things that they're doing. I hope you'll come back again sometime soon and keep us in your mind as you go across the country and talk to more people and continue to build democracy out there. So thank you. For the folks on the call, I did put in the chat, I'll put one more time, a link to DFLI if you want to sign up. We have a mobilized sign up for our biweekly meetings. That's how you can get in. And we'll be having more stuff along the way. And you'll be notified by signing up to that mobilized site. Thank you very much. We are going to stay on the phone for a little bit. We're gonna release Robert because I'm sure he's got writing already in his mind for tomorrow. And for folks who want to hang out a little bit longer, we'll just chat a bit. Thanks again so much. Travel safely and be well. Appreciate everything that you've done.